You see the name Trump, you think of gold letters on a skyscraper. You think of reality TV, and you think of the White House. But what if I told you the entire empire, the brand, the power, the presidency, was built on a set of brutal lessons taught by one of America's most feared and notorious political fixers? This isn't just a story about success. It's a story of bankruptcies reframed as genius, marital scandals that became tabloid gold, and a political takeover that left a nation divided. We're digging past the myth to find the truth of the Trump dynasty. The New York of the 1970s was a world away from the gleaming, sanitized metropolis we know today. It was a city on its knees. It was teetering on the very edge of bankruptcy, a grimy, graffiti-scarred battlefield of soaring crime rates, social unrest, and a deep, pervasive sense of decay. The wealthy were fleeing to the suburbs, businesses were shuttering, and entire neighborhoods looked like war zones. The Bronx was literally burning. The subway was a terrifying labyrinth of crime and filth. Times Square was a seedy collection of porn theaters and dive bars. The city was a wounded beast, snarling and dangerous. But amidst that decay, there was a strange, frantic energy. It was a city of stark, dramatic contrasts. It was the New York of Studio 54, where Andy Warhol, Liza Minnelli, and a parade of celebrities danced the night away in a blizzard of cocaine and disco lights. It was the New York of CBGB, where punk rock was being born in a dingy Bowery club. It was a city where fortunes could be made and lost overnight, a place where the old rules were breaking down, creating a vacuum for anyone with enough nerve and audacity to fill it. This was the cauldron that forged Donald Trump. He wasn't a product of the old money Manhattan elite, the Rockefellers or the Astors, who looked down on his family with disdain. He was a prince of the outer boroughs, the son of a man who had built a real estate empire far from the glittering spires of Fifth Avenue. His father, Fred Trump, was a formidable figure in his own right. He was a tough, shrewd, and deeply ambitious man, the son of German immigrants who had started his real estate career in his early 20s. Fred was a master of the mundane. He made his fortune building sturdy, unglamorous middle-class apartment blocks in Brooklyn and Queens. He understood government subsidies. He knew how to navigate the city's Byzantine bureaucracy, and he knew how to squeeze every last penny out of a construction contract. He was a man of caution and profound thrift. Anecdotes abound of Fred Trump walking his own construction sites after the workers had left, picking up stray nails to be reused. He was a brilliant but parochial businessman. His world was bounded by the boroughs he knew and understood. Manhattan to him was a dangerous, glamorous island best avoided. But for his fourth child and second son, Donald, Manhattan was everything. It was the Emerald City, the ultimate prize. From a young age, Donald was different from his siblings. He was louder, more aggressive, more desperate for attention. His father, seeing this raw, untamed energy, sent him to the New York Military Academy at the age of 13, hoping to instill some discipline in the boy. And while it may have straightened him out physically, it only seemed to sharpen his killer instinct. After attending Fordham University and then the Wharton School of Finance, he joined his father's company, Elizabeth Trump and Son. But he was restless. The world of rent-controlled apartments in Flatbush held no appeal for him. He saw his father's success not as a legacy to be maintained, but as a launch pad. Fred Trump had given him a name and a considerable financial head start, but Donald was determined to eclipse him, to build a brand that would be famous not just in Queens, but around the world. To do this, he needed a mentor, someone who understood the dark arts of power in New York City. And he found him in a man named Roy Cohn. Cohn was one of the most feared and influential lawyers in America. He had been Senator Joseph McCarthy's chief counsel during the infamous anti-communist hearings of the 1950s. He was a brutal, ruthless political fixer who operated in the shadows, a master of intimidation, media manipulation, and bare-knuckle litigation. When the Trump Company was sued by the Justice Department in 1973 for alleged racial discrimination in its housing rentals, a major scandal that threatened the family's reputation, it was Roy Cohn that Fred and Donald turned to. Cohn's advice to the young Donald Trump was simple and would form the bedrock of his entire future playbook. First, never admit defeat, never apologize. Second, when attacked, hit back 10 times harder. And third, use the media as your personal weapon. Cohn taught Trump to countersue, to attack the accusers, to bury his opponents in paperwork and legal fees. He introduced him to the city's power brokers, to the newspaper columnists and the television producers. Cohn wasn't just Trump's lawyer. He was his professor in the art of public warfare. The relationship was symbiotic. For Cohn, Trump was a brash, ambitious protege. For Trump, Cohn was the key that unlocked the city, providing the legal and political muscle he needed to make his move on Manhattan. His first major project was a masterstroke of audacity. He targeted the Commodore Hotel, a faded, bankrupt Grand Dame next to Grand Central Terminal. The building was an eyesore, a symbol of the city's decline. But where others saw ruin, Trump, with his father's financial backing, saw opportunity. With New York City itself on the verge of fiscal collapse, the politicians were desperate for any sign of private investment. Trump swept in, not as a supplicant, but as a savior. He promised a gleaming new hotel that would herald a new era for the city. He charmed, cajoled, and bullied the city's officials. And with Roy Cohn pulling strings behind the scenes, he secured an unprecedented 40-year tax abatement, a deal so generous it was practically a gift from the city. The result was the Grand Hyatt, which opened in 1980. It was a sleek, modern tower of reflective glass, a stark contrast to the grimy Beaux-Arts facade of Grand Central next to it. It was an instant success, and it made Donald Trump a star. He had done what his father had never dared to do. He had conquered a piece of Manhattan. This project established the Trump template: find a distressed but high-profile asset, use salesmanship and political connections to secure massive public subsidies, and put his name on the final glamorous product. But the Grand Hyatt was just the overture. The main event was to come. Trump had his sights set on a prime piece of real estate on Fifth Avenue, right next to the iconic Tiffany & Company. He wanted to build the most luxurious, most spectacular skyscraper the city had ever seen. This would be Trump Tower. The process of acquiring the site was a classic Trump operation. The location was occupied by the beloved Bonwit Teller Building, an Art Deco masterpiece. Despite pleas from preservationists and the Metropolitan Museum of Art to save the building's distinctive sculptures and facade, Trump ordered them jackhammered into rubble, a move that earned him the scorn of the city's cultural elite, but generated a storm of priceless publicity. When Trump Tower opened in 1983, it was the physical embodiment of the new greed is good era. It was a 58-story monument to 1980s excess. The lobby was a 6-story atrium of gleaming pinkish-orange marble and polished brass, complete with an 80-foot indoor waterfall. It was deliberately, unapologetically ostentatious. Trump didn't just sell apartments in the building, he sold a brand. He courted celebrity residents, from Johnny Carson to Michael Jackson. He moved his own family into a sprawling 3-level penthouse at the very top, a space decorated in a style that could only be described as a modern-day Versailles, dripping with gold, marble, and mirrors. The tower became his command center, the symbol of his empire, and the backdrop for countless magazine covers and television interviews. He was no longer just a developer. He was a celebrity, a living symbol of wealth and success. At his side during this meteoric rise was his first wife, Ivana. They had met in 1976 and married a year later. Ivana was not just a glamorous accessory. She was a formidable partner in the business. A sharp, ambitious Czech immigrant and former model, she had a keen eye for design and a relentless work ethic. Donald put her in charge of interior design for Trump Tower and later made her the president of the Trump Castle Casino in Atlantic City and the legendary Plaza Hotel after he acquired it in 1988. They were New York's ultimate power couple. Their lavish lifestyle and carefully managed public image a constant source of fascination for the tabloids. They had 3 children, Donald Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, who were raised in the gilded cage of the Trump Tower penthouse, groomed from birth to be the heirs to the burgeoning dynasty. Throughout the 1980s, Trump's ambition seemed to have no limits. He was a whirlwind of activity, a master of leveraging his name into new ventures. He bought an American football team, the New Jersey Generals. He bought a massive yacht, the Trump Princess. He launched his own airline, the Trump Shuttle. And he made a huge high-stakes gamble on the newly legalized casino industry in Atlantic City, building the Trump Plaza, the Trump Castle, and his most ambitious project of all, the colossal billion-dollar Trump Taj Mahal. He also published his first book, The Art of the Deal, a ghost-written memoir and business manual that became a massive bestseller. It cemented his public image as a brilliant, infallible dealmaker, a man who always came out on top. In a series of tense meetings, a consortium of banks effectively took control of his life. They put him on a strict personal budget of $450,000 a month, a galling restriction for a man whose identity was synonymous with limitless spending. He was forced to fly commercial to mortgage Trump Tower to put his brand, his very name, at the mercy of the bankers he had once looked down upon. One of his own casino executives, John O'Donnell, would later write a scathing tell-all book titled Trumped, describing him as a man in deep denial, unable to grasp the magnitude of his own failure. The King of New York had been dethroned, but it was in this moment of absolute defeat that another side of Donald Trump emerged. While his business was in ruins, he immediately began the work of rewriting the narrative. In his version of events, this was not a failure. It was a brilliant strategic maneuver. He publicly boasted about using the bankruptcy laws of the United States to his advantage. He portrayed himself not as a victim of his own hubris, but as a savvy operator who had outsmarted the banks. He was framing his collapse as the beginning of his greatest comeback. It was a narrative of survival, of a fighter who had been knocked down but would inevitably get back up. And, to the astonishment of many, it worked. He managed to convince the banks that his name, the Trump brand, was still his single most valuable asset. The buildings were worth more with his name on them than without it. It was a masterful bluff, and it saved him from personal bankruptcy, allowing him to restructure his debts and cling to a small piece of his shattered empire. The mid-1990s were his wilderness years. He married Marla Maples in 1993, and they had a daughter, Tiffany. But the marriage was short-lived and lacked the public fascination of his union with Ivana. He was still a celebrity, a fixture in the gossip columns, but he was a diminished figure. The brash, invincible titan of the 80s had been replaced by a more subdued, almost humbled version of himself. He was no longer building monuments. Instead, he embarked on a new, far less glamorous business strategy, licensing. He began selling his name as a brand to be stamped on other people's projects. For a fee, A developer in Florida or Turkey or the Philippines could call their new condominium Trump Palace or Trump Towers. It was a business model born of necessity. It allowed him to generate income and maintain his public profile without risking any of his own capital. He was transitioning from a developer into a brand manager. This quiet period of rebuilding culminated in the venture that would not only restore his fortune, but transform his identity on a global scale. In the early 2000s, television producer Mark Burnett, the man behind the hit reality show Survivor, had an idea for a new show. It would be an urban Survivor, a competition series set in the cutthroat world of business. He needed a real-life tycoon to be the star, the ultimate corporate titan who would judge the contestants. He needed Donald Trump. When The Apprentice debuted in 2004, it was an instant runaway success. The show was a work of genius, a perfectly crafted piece of television that presented a highly stylized, mythologized version of Donald Trump to a new generation. Gone was the humbled, bankrupt casino owner of the 1990s. In his place was the ultimate CEO, a decisive, no-nonsense billionaire who presided over a fictional empire from a lavish fictional boardroom. The show was meticulously edited to enhance his image. He was flown in by helicopter, chauffeured in limousines, and filmed in the most glamorous settings. The contestants, a group of ambitious young people, treated him with a level of deference usually reserved for royalty. The show's dramatic climax each week was the boardroom scene, a televised tribunal where Trump would pass judgment on the contestants' performance, culminating in the two words that would become his global catchphrase, "You're fired." That phrase, delivered with a decisive point of his finger, entered the cultural lexicon. It made him more famous than he had ever been before. The Apprentice was not just a television show. It was a 14-season-long commercial for the Trump brand. It erased the memory of his failures and replaced it with a powerful, easily digestible narrative of business genius. It made him a folk hero to millions of people who saw him as the embodiment of success. It gave him a direct line into the living rooms of mainstream America, a platform of immense power and influence. The comeback was complete. He was no longer just a New York real estate mogul. He was a global television icon. This newfound fame, built on a carefully constructed reality TV persona, had awakened an even grander ambition, one that would soon take him from the boardroom to the political stage, a move that the world was not remotely prepared for. The boardroom on The Apprentice was more than just a television set. It was a laboratory. It was here that Donald Trump perfected a powerful new persona, a fantasy of decisive, no-nonsense leadership that millions of Americans found deeply appealing. This carefully crafted character would soon escape the confines of the TV screen as he began to test its power in a new and far more volatile arena, the world of American politics. To truly grasp the political phenomenon of Donald Trump, one has to understand that his presidency didn't begin in 2017. In a way, it began in that fictional boardroom on the set of The Apprentice. The show was a 14-season-long political advertisement, a masterclass in branding that sold a myth to the American public. It presented a simple, powerful, and deeply seductive fantasy of leadership. In the chaotic, nuanced, and often frustratingly complex world of real business and politics, Trump's television persona offered a clear alternative, a decisive, tough, patriarchal figure who could instantly identify problems, assess blame, and deliver a swift, unambiguous verdict. "You're fired" wasn't just a catchphrase. It was a promise of a world without bureaucracy, without compromise, without excuses. It was a fantasy of ultimate control, and millions of viewers found it incredibly appealing. The show meticulously crafted this image using helicopter shots of his gleaming towers, reverential testimonials from contestants, and dramatic editing to portray him not as a mere businessman, but as an aspirational symbol of American success. As the show's popularity soared, Trump began to expertly blur the lines between his television character and his real-world commentary. He became a ubiquitous presence on cable news and talk shows, not to discuss real estate, but to offer his blunt, often controversial opinions on everything from foreign policy to pop culture. He had a unique talent for generating headlines, for saying the thing that was just outrageous enough to guarantee a news cycle. He was, in essence, conducting a long-form public audition, testing his brand and his messaging in the court of public opinion. He was discovering that the skills he had honed, self-promotion, media manipulation, and the creation of a simple, powerful narrative, were just as effective in the political arena as they were in business or entertainment. His presidential ambitions were not a sudden whim. They were a long-held fantasy that he had flirted with for decades. As far back as 2000, he had explored a run for the presidency with the Reform Party, a campaign that ultimately fizzled but gave him his first taste of the political game. For years, he was a political tease, periodically dropping hints about a potential run, commissioning polls and giving speeches in early primary states, all of which generated a flurry of media attention before he would inevitably back away. It was a clever strategy that kept his name in the political conversation and allowed him to build a profile without ever having to subject himself to the rigors of a real campaign. The game changed in 2011. This was the moment his political dalliance turned into something far more serious and far more sinister. He became the most prominent and relentless champion of the birther conspiracy theory, a baseless and racist lie that President Barack Obama, the nation's first African-American president, was not born in the United States and was therefore an illegitimate president. Trump used his massive media platform to push this conspiracy from the fringes into the mainstream. He went on television day after day demanding to see Obama's long-form birth certificate, hinting that he had investigators in Hawaii who were finding unbelievable things. For a significant segment of the Republican base that was deeply hostile to the Obama presidency, Trump's birther crusade was a rallying cry. He was saying out loud what they had been whispering in private. He was challenging the establishment. He was unafraid to be called a racist. And he was taking the fight directly to a president they despised. He became the de facto leader of the anti-Obama opposition, a political force in his own right, all without ever holding office. The episode was a chilling preview of the political style he would later perfect, leveraging a media spectacle, amplifying a conspiracy theory, and positioning himself as the fearless champion of a grievance-fueled movement. The birther saga reached a dramatic climax at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in April 2011. Just days after President Obama had finally released his long-form birth certificate to put the matter to rest, he stood at the podium and delivered a blistering 10-minute roast of Donald Trump, who was sitting in the audience. With the entire Washington press corps and a host of celebrities laughing along, Obama mercilessly mocked Trump's conspiracy theories, his television show, and his political pretensions. It was a brutal public humiliation. Many journalists and biographers who were in the room that night would later point to this moment as the key turning point, the instant that a potential Trump presidency went from a public relations stunt to a burning personal quest for revenge. The laughter in that room, they argued, solidified his determination to one day have the last laugh. 4 years later, on a sunny morning in June 2015, he did. In a moment of pure political theater, Donald and Melania Trump descended the golden escalator of Trump Tower into a lobby filled with supporters and a massive press contingent. What followed was an announcement speech unlike any other in American political history. It was a rambling stream of consciousness diatribe that careened from boasts about his wealth to dire warnings about the state of the nation. And it contained the lines that would ignite his campaign and set the tone for everything that was to come. He accused Mexico of sending drugs, crime, and rapists across the border. The reaction from the political and corporate establishment was instantaneous and furious. NBC, the network that aired The Apprentice, immediately severed all ties with him. Other corporate partners followed suit. The consensus among the political experts was clear. His campaign was over before it had even begun. He had gone too far, but the experts were wrong. The controversial remarks that had horrified the establishment had electrified a segment of the electorate that felt ignored and betrayed by both political parties. They saw his blunt, politically incorrect language not as a flaw, but as a sign of authenticity, a refreshing break from the carefully polished talking points of traditional politicians. This became the central dynamic of his campaign. The more the media and the political elite condemned him, the more his supporters rallied to his side. He had created an insurgency. His run for the Republican nomination was a hostile takeover of a political party. He faced a crowded field of 16 other candidates, including seasoned governors and senators. One by one, he demolished them. He turned the presidential debates, normally staid policy discussions, into schoolyard brawls. He branded his opponents with simple, devastating nicknames. Jeb Bush became Low Energy Jeb, Marco Rubio became Little Marco, Ted Cruz became Lion Ted. He dominated the news cycle with a constant stream of outrageous statements and a masterful use of his Twitter account, which he used as a direct, unfiltered line to his supporters and a weapon to attack his enemies. While his opponents were spending millions on traditional political ads, Trump was getting billions of dollars in free media coverage. The cable news networks, addicted to the ratings he generated, broadcast his rallies live and unedited, turning his campaign into a non-stop reality show. By the time the Republican convention arrived in the summer of 2016, the party establishment was in shock. The outsider they had dismissed as a joke had seized control of their party. The general election against the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton, was one of the most brutal and divisive in modern American history. It was a clash of two Americas, a battle between a candidate who represented the political establishment and one who was determined to burn it to the ground. Trump was plagued by scandal, most notably the release of the Access Hollywood tape, in which he was caught on a hot mic boasting about sexually assaulting women. It was a moment that would have ended the career of any other politician. But Trump, true to the Roy Cohn playbook, didn't apologize. He attacked. He brought the women who had accused Bill Clinton of sexual misconduct to the next presidential debate. He managed to survive his supporters either dismissing the tape as locker room talk or simply not caring. His message was simple, powerful, and relentless. Make America great again. It was a slogan that resonated deeply in the deindustrialized towns of the Rust Belt, places that had been hollowed out by globalization and felt left behind by the cultural and economic changes of the 21st century. He promised to bring back the coal mines, to renegotiate the trade deals, to build a wall on the border, and to restore a sense of national pride that his supporters felt had been lost. On the night of November 8, 2016, the world watched in stunned disbelief. The polls had predicted a comfortable victory for Hillary Clinton. The media experts were certain of the outcome. But as the results began to trickle in from states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, a different reality began to emerge. The political earthquake that had been building for over a year had finally struck. Donald J. Trump, the real estate mogul, the tabloid fixture, the reality television star, had been elected the 45th President of the United States. He had achieved the impossible. The ultimate outsider had stormed the gates of power. As the shock wore off, it was replaced by a series of profound and deeply unsettling questions that echoed around the globe. What would a Trump presidency actually look like? What would it mean for America and for the world? Could this man, who had built his entire life and career on breaking rules and shattering norms, now be entrusted to lead a nation that was governed by them? The unreality show was over. A new, far more consequential one was about to begin. The political earthquake had struck, leaving a nation and a world in stunned disbelief. The man who had run a campaign of pure spectacle, who had shattered every norm of American politics, now held its highest office. The central question that echoed around the globe was no longer if he could win, but what he would do with that victory. The answer would come swiftly, and it would be an emphatic, resounding no to the idea of a conventional presidency. The transition period itself was a sign of things to come. It was a chaotic, often amateurish scramble that eschewed the traditional, orderly handover of power. The Trump team, seemingly as surprised by their victory as everyone else, struggled to fill key cabinet positions. The process was less like a government in waiting and more like a casting call for a new season of The Apprentice, with a parade of potential appointees trekking to Trump Tower or his Bedminster Golf Club for public auditions. Then came the inauguration. On January 20th, 2017, standing on the steps of the Capitol, Donald Trump delivered an address that would set the tone for his entire presidency. It was not a speech of unity or healing, as is traditional. It was a dark, dystopian vision of a nation in peril. He spoke of American carnage, of rusted-out factories scattered like tombstones, of a failed and corrupt establishment that had enriched itself while impoverishing the nation. He promised that this carnage would stop right here and right now. It was a declaration of war on the very institutions he was now charged with leading. His first full day in office was consumed not by policy, but by a furious and obsessive dispute with the media over the size of his inauguration crowd, a trivial matter that he and his press secretary, Sean Spicer, elevated into a major confrontation, complete with claims of alternative facts. From the very first weekend, the central themes of his presidency were established: a perpetual state of conflict, a war on the media, and a complete rejection of objective reality in favor of his own preferred narrative. He governed as he had campaigned, through instinct, aggression, and a constant stream of tweets. His Twitter account became a primary instrument of the executive branch, an unfiltered 280-character stream of consciousness used to announce major policy decisions, praise allies, attack his perceived enemies, and generate a relentless churn of news cycles that left the country in a state of perpetual whiplash. Just 1 week into his term, he signed an executive order for a travel ban, barring entry to people from 7 Muslim-majority countries. The order was rolled out with little to no coordination with the relevant government agencies, causing chaos and panic at airports around the world and sparking massive immediate protests. It was a clear signal that he intended to rule by decree, to act as the CEO of America, with little patience for the legal and constitutional constraints on his power. This immediately put him on a collision course with what he and his supporters would come to call the deep state, the career professionals within the government's intelligence, law enforcement, and diplomatic agencies. The conflict escalated dramatically in May 2017 with his abrupt firing of FBI Director James Comey. Comey had been leading the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and the possible links between the Trump campaign and Moscow. Trump's stated reason for the firing shifted daily, but he later admitted in a television interview that he was thinking of this Russia thing when he did it. The act, which drew comparisons to the Saturday Night Massacre under Richard Nixon, was seen by his critics as a clear attempt to obstruct justice. The immediate consequence was the appointment of a special counsel, the highly respected former FBI Director Robert Mueller, to take over the investigation. For the next 2 years, the Mueller investigation would hang over the Trump presidency like a dark cloud. Trump, true to the Roy Cohn playbook, went on the offensive. He relentlessly attacked the investigation as a witch hunt, a politically motivated hoax cooked up by his enemies to delegitimize his presidency. The investigation resulted in the indictment or guilty pleas of 34 individuals, including his former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, his former campaign chairman Paul Manafort, and his longtime personal lawyer and fixer Michael Cohn. In the spring of 2019, Mueller submitted his report. It concluded that Russia had interfered in the election in a sweeping and systematic fashion, but it did not find sufficient evidence to establish a criminal conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Crucially, however, on the question of whether Trump had obstructed justice, the report did not exonerate him. It detailed 10 separate instances where Trump had potentially obstructed justice and stated that while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. While the Mueller saga played out, Trump pursued his policy agenda with a similar disruptive zeal. His one major legislative achievement was a massive tax cut passed in 2017 that primarily benefited corporations and the wealthy. But his more lasting impact came in his reshaping of the federal judiciary. He successfully appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court: Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. The confirmation hearing for Brett Kavanaugh, who faced credible accusations of sexual assault, devolved into one of the most bitter and partisan spectacles in modern political history, a cultural flashpoint that exposed the raw, gaping wounds of the nation's culture wars. On the world stage, he pursued a policy of America first, a nationalist doctrine that upended decades of American foreign policy. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement on climate change and the Iran nuclear deal. He launched a costly trade war with China. He questioned the value of long-standing alliances like NATO. At the same time, he engaged in a highly personalized and often bizarre form of diplomacy, lavishing praise on authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un, with whom he held 3 unprecedented summits that were high on spectacle but low on substantive results. In the autumn of 2019, he faced his first impeachment. A whistleblower from within the intelligence community revealed that Trump had engaged in a phone call with the newly elected president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. On that call, Trump had pressured Zelensky to announce an investigation into his chief political rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter. The allegation was that Trump was using the power of his office and withholding nearly $400 million in vital military aid to solicit foreign interference in the upcoming 2020 election. The Democratic-controlled House of Representatives swiftly voted to impeach him on 2 articles: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. He became only the 3rd president in U.S. history to be impeached. The trial in the Republican-controlled Senate, however, was a foregone conclusion. He was acquitted in early 2020, an outcome that he claimed as a complete and total exoneration, and which seemed to leave him feeling more emboldened and unrestrained than ever. He entered the 2020 election year on a political high, but the world was about to be upended by a force even more disruptive than himself. The COVID-19 pandemic, a once-in-a-century global health crisis, would come to define the final year of his presidency. His handling of the pandemic was widely criticized. He consistently downplayed the threat of the virus, publicly contradicted his own scientific advisors, like Dr. Anthony Fauci, promoted unproven and dangerous treatments like hydroxychloroquine, and turned basic public health measures like mask wearing into partisan political statements. While his administration's Operation Warp Speed did help to accelerate the development of a vaccine, his public rhetoric and his administration's chaotic response were seen by many as a catastrophic failure of leadership. As the pandemic raged, the country was convulsed by another crisis. The murder of George Floyd, an unarmed black man by a Minneapolis police officer, sparked a wave of massive protests against racial injustice and police brutality that swept across the nation. Trump responded with a hardline law and order message, deploying federal agents to cities and threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act. In one of the most controversial moments of his presidency, federal officers used tear gas to forcibly clear peaceful protesters from Lafayette Square, across from the White House, so that he could walk to the historic St. John's Church for a photo op, where he awkwardly held up a Bible. He lost the 2020 election to Joe Biden, but he refused to accept the result. In the weeks and months that followed, he and his allies launched an unprecedented assault on the foundations of American democracy. He relentlessly pushed the big lie, a baseless and sprawling conspiracy theory, that the election had been stolen through widespread voter fraud. He filed dozens of lawsuits across the country, all of which were thrown out of court for lack of evidence. He pressured state election officials to find him more votes. He tried to get the Justice Department to declare the election corrupt. This campaign culminated on January 6, 2021. As Congress met to certify the results of the election, Trump held a massive rally for his supporters near the White House. He repeated his false claims of a stolen election and urged the crowd to march to the Capitol and fight like hell. What followed was a scene of shocking violence and insurrection. A mob of his supporters, incited by his rhetoric, stormed the U.S. Capitol, overwhelming the police, breaking into the building, and forcing lawmakers to flee for their lives. For hours, the seat of American democracy was under siege. The attack resulted in the deaths of 5 people and a stain on the nation's history. For his role in inciting the insurrection, the House of Representatives impeached him for a second time, making him the only president to ever be impeached twice. He left office in disgrace, but he did not go away. He established a new power center at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, maintaining an iron grip on the Republican Party and continuing to tease a potential run for the presidency in 2024. He remains a figure of immense influence and controversy, a man who, despite being out of office, still dominates the American political landscape. The storm he unleashed has not subsided. The final chapter of his tumultuous public life and the legal and political reckonings that may still await him have yet to be written. The presidency of Donald Trump may be over, but the questions about his ultimate impact on the nation he led and on the very fabric of its democracy are only just beginning to be understood. And so he left office, not with a quiet fade, but with a political storm that still rages. To truly understand the legacy of this turbulent chapter in American history, we must look beyond the daily chaos of his presidency. We must examine the deeper impact he had on the institutions he led, the party he remade, and the very nature of truth in the modern age. For decades, American politics, for all its partisan bitterness, had operated within a set of unwritten rules. A respect for the peaceful transfer of power, a deference to democratic institutions like the courts and the free press, a basic consensus on the nature of truth and facts. Donald Trump did not just bend these rules, he took a sledgehammer to them. He demonstrated that a political leader could openly question the legitimacy of an election, could label the press the enemy of the people, could fire those charged with investigating him, and not only survive politically, but thrive. He revealed that these norms were far more fragile than anyone had previously believed, held together not by law, but by a shared sense of propriety that he simply did not possess. The question that now hangs over American democracy is whether those shattered norms can ever be fully restored. His takeover of the Republican Party was as total as it was hostile. He transformed it from the party of Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, a party defined by its belief in free trade, global alliances, and social conservatism, into a new entity forged in his own image. The modern GOP is the party of America First nationalism, of populist grievance, of a deep-seated hostility to institutions, and, above all else, of absolute personal loyalty to him. His influence is so complete that even out of office he remains its undisputed leader, its kingmaker, and its most potent fundraising force. The party's ideological transformation is a testament to his unique ability to connect with a base that felt ignored by its own leaders. The most profound and lasting effects of Donald Trump's presidency can be seen in two key areas. He fundamentally altered the media landscape by relentlessly attacking the press with cries of fake news, exploiting and deepening the partisan divide. This created a political environment where the narrative pushed by a trusted source became more important than objective facts, leading to a critical democratic crisis where citizens can no longer agree on a shared set of basic truths. Perhaps even more significantly, his time in office eroded the very nature of truth itself. He mainstreamed the concept of alternative facts and proved that a powerful political movement could be built and sustained on a constant torrent of falsehoods. By demonstrating that a lie, if repeated with enough force and conviction, can become a political identity for millions, he fostered a dangerous destruction of shared reality. As a result, the common ground required for democratic compromise has become almost impossible to find. And what of the family itself? The Trump presidency was, from beginning to end, a family affair. His children, once known primarily as heirs to a real estate fortune and supporting characters on his reality show, were elevated to positions of unprecedented power. Donald Jr. became a fiery political attack dog and a hero to his father's base. Eric took over the running of the family business, and Ivanka, along with her husband Jared Kushner, became senior advisors in the White House, a move that shattered anti-nepotism norms and raised constant questions about conflicts of interest. The lines between family, business, and the state were not just blurred, they were erased entirely. The dream of a Trump dynasty, once confined to the world of real estate, had metastasized into the realm of national politics, with all the accompanying scrutiny and scandal. So how will history ultimately judge Donald J. Trump and his family? The story is a quintessential American epic, a tale of ambition so vast it eventually consumed everything in its path. It's the story of a man who craved legitimacy from the Manhattan elite who scorned him, and when they refused to give it to him, he bypassed them entirely. seeking validation instead from the roar of the crowd and the unwavering loyalty of a political base that saw him as their champion. He was a master of branding, and his greatest product was himself. He sold a fantasy of success, first through his buildings, then through his television show, and finally through his politics. The saga of the Trump family is a profound and often disturbing, cautionary tale. It reveals the awesome power of modern media to create a persona that can eclipse a far more complex and controversial reality. It's a lesson in the fragility of democratic institutions when they are confronted by a leader who holds them in contempt. And it is a story that shows how deep-seated grievances over economic and cultural change can be harnessed by a charismatic figure who promises a return to a mythical, better past. In the end, the gleaming towers still bear his name, and his political movement still commands the loyalty of millions. But the brand that was once synonymous with gold-plated luxury and aspirational success is now inextricably linked to a far more turbulent legacy, a legacy of division, of chaos, and of a democratic nation pushed to its breaking point. The story of the Trumps is a story of a family that achieved a level of wealth and power almost unimaginable to their immigrant ancestors. They reached the very pinnacle of the American dream, only to demonstrate how that same dream, when twisted by limitless ambition and a hunger for celebrity, can threaten to become a nightmare.